This year's edition of the Nedbank and Old Mutual Budget Speech Competition has seen participants tackling some of the most pressing economic issues facing South Africa. One of the finalists focused on the performance of Eskom, rising domestic debt and trade policy openness. Wits University Economics and Philosophy graduate Cuba Houghton also posed some questions to the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. He joins us now for more on his essay. Thank you very much, Cuba, and I guess congratulations to you for making it this far. What was the appeal with the competition? Why did you want to go for it?
Thank you for having me. I think my appeal with the competition, my motivation to submit my essay to the competition was basically an attempt to satisfy my curiosity. As an international student coming to South Africa, I was very curious about certain economic realities that I was faced with. For example, the paradox between South Africa being Africa's most industrialized country, but at the same time having these electricity supply or load shedding constraints. And, the essay in part was also a response to some of the personal experiences I had in South Africa. For example, there was an afternoon where I was sitting in a barbershop in Braamfontein and getting my standard level 2 haircut. And in the middle of the haircut, the load shedding occurred, right? And so I had this loud sigh across the room. And I remember looking into the eyes of the barber at the time, and I saw the amount of distress and the amount of sadness in his face. And I realized what load shedding meant for him, days on end, weeks on end, 4 hours of lost customers and foregone income, right? And so I started to look at this on a macroeconomic level and found that not only on a micro level is load shedding affecting the lives of daily citizens and businesses, but it's also affecting economic growth. And so that really led me to submit the essay and really investigate these issues more closely.
And what did you find as you investigated the issues more closely?
Well, so my essay looked at historically what the impact of these three issues that you mentioned, which is Eskom performance, trade openness, and the levels of domestic debt has been on economic growth in the past 2 decades, and looked at what these are likely to mean for the future. And we found that overall the trends or the preference for South Africa to take on domestic debt, as well as the constraints to local border trade, and of course the load shedding crisis, are likely to cause economic growth to decrease over the medium term, which is within the next 3 or 4 years. And so my analysis also includes some recommendations and mitigating measures for this outlook, which include South Africa's need to diversify in its energy generation to include more renewable generation capacity, but also to enhance trade agreements like the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and finally to diversify its debt mix by taking on more foreign debt relative to domestic debt in order to improve the terms on which South Africa borrows.
On the African Continental Free Trade Area, we'll get to that in a few moments, but I just want to talk about maybe home, Kenya. When you take a look at Kenya and South Africa, are there similarities between the two of us when we talk about the energy issue?
So there are a few similarities across the board if you look at it from an economic perspective. And also political perspective. We still have, corruption issues. We still have issues of mismanagement of funds, service delivery issues, inflation, and also debt crisis. But I think what's been interesting is seeing what the countries can learn from each other. So, for example, Kenya, around 80% of Kenya's renewable energy generation, energy capacity is actually renewable. So I think a majority of it is hydroelectric. And so I think Kenya's quite a step ahead in terms of renewable capacity generation. And I think that's something that South Africa could learn from. I think also in looking at the labor markets, about 80% of employment in Kenya is informal employment in the formal sector, looking at people who are, enterprising individuals, people who are entrepreneurial and tend to innovate and create their own businesses as opposed to look for formal employment, which, in comparison to South Africa, we see that South Africa's employment is about 20% in the formal market. And so there's certain, I think, similarities or parallels and divergence that we can look at to, as an African continent in general, to better leverage our costs and our strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah. So in Kenya, is there legislation that actually supports informal trade?
In a sense, there is, but I'd say the institutional structure of the Kenyan economy is supportive of that. I think, we have quite good availabilities for finance, for small to medium enterprises, and also strong intellectual property laws that facilitate, businesses starting out and businesses innovating. And I think that's been really instrumental in the growth, I guess, of the informal markets, although now we're seeing that the government wants to tax the informal market a bit more, which we are yet to see how that will look. But overall, I think, yes, the business environment is quite conducive.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, that you concluded your essay with the assertion that economic growth will most likely deteriorate over the next 3 years. You mentioned AFTA, and so how can it help in bolstering not only economic growth on the continent, but just seeing what other countries are doing, right? You mentioned that Kenya is a step ahead when it comes to the energy environment, and so learning from each other as well.
Well, I think, for South Africa specifically, I think it's one of the countries that are best placed to benefit from the Continental Free Trade Agreement because, South Africa exports high-value manufactured products like cars. It exports several cars to Europe. It exports chemical materials. It exports electrical appliances. And these are commodities or goods that other African countries aren't as good at producing because, of the level of industrialization across the continent. And so, from a South African perspective, there's that kind of opportunity to create export markets for very high-value products. And, also, I think if you look at what's been happening in terms of economic integration across the world, we see that, for example, in the European Union, where, there's a very strong kind of customs union, there's almost no cost of border compliance, right, which is an issue that South Africa has been struggling with, according to the World Bank doing a business report of 2021. And so, in terms of, not only creating export markets, but easing the flow of trade across borders, I think South Africa could really benefit from the agreement. And I think in terms of benefits for the African economy as a whole, I think the overall benefit is to reduce reliance on external markets and the rest of the world, the globe, for the economies to run, because we see that in the recent aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, or the war in Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia, we find that Africa has been really affected by the levels of inflation and the commodity price soars that we saw and that we have been seeing. And so I think in terms of the long-term prosperity of Africa, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement offers immense opportunities.
Cuba, how do we do that when a number of countries, very few, have ratified the free movement of persons, which will make this a reality, right? And so how do we achieve that greatness and that integration if at such as basic as it is, it's also quite a big thing, right? So we're not by any stretch of the imagination downplaying it, but how do we unlock that potential if we're not even able to move in our own continent?
I think you make a good point. The free movement of persons protocol is one of the measures alongside the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. The AU, the African Union, is really championing towards more economic integration. And I think, part of the slow movement has been, the legal challenges with the free movement of persons. We have to talk about adjustments in the labor market and, what that means for different tax regimes across countries and things. But I think there's already been, such a positive movement towards the ratification of these agreements. So, for example, the Africa Continental Trade Agreement has been ratified by 44 out of 54 countries, which is quite promising. And we're also seeing more multilateral and bilateral engagements among African countries. So, for example, between Kenya and South Africa, and on my recent visit to Cape Town for the finals of the budget speech competition, I was there on a recent visa-free agreement that was introduced as recently as January this year. And so we're already kind of seeing this movement, but it is a work in progress, and it's not going to happen overnight. And I think keeping Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and the Free Movement of Persons Protocol in the conversation is important in long-term prosperity.
Yeah. How is the East African community doing with regards to that? I understand that, you've got one sort of identification and you can get around in East Africa similar to West Africa.
Well, it's great because, I think at the moment it's just Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya that have introduced the East African Community Passport, which is a nice blue passport that I have. And it's really enabled a free movement of people among borders. So if I want to go to Uganda and perhaps set up a business, it's a more streamlined process than it is, perhaps to another country. And so I think it's really facilitated greater economic trade and integration in the region. And we're already seeing the benefits of that. Personally, I've seen the benefits of that. So I think, that's been great.
Okay. Let's get back to the competition. You had an opportunity to ask the Finance Minister some questions. What did you ask him and what did you hear back?
So yeah, like you're saying, I got him to opportunity to ask him two questions, right? And the questions were developed on behalf of, together with my other undergraduate finalists, the 10 of us from across South Africa. And the first question is really around the longevity of Eskom as a sole electricity supplier in South Africa. And this was in response to the announcement by the minister in his budget speech that he'd be introducing tax incentives or tax relief to individuals for the installation of solar rooftop panels and for businesses for the generation of renewable energy capacity. And, this was kind of viewed as movements to reduce the dependence of people on Eskom and enhance their ability to produce their own electricity. So the question of the longevity of Eskom, and the long-term viability of Eskom in electricity generation was our concern. And the second question was essentially around measures that the government was to take in order to combat the rising unemployment crisis as well as the struggling SMEs, right, small and medium enterprises. And in response to these questions, the minister basically said that, made a good point that although these last two issues were not specifically mentioned in the budget speech, a lot of the measures that were introduced are likely to affect, unemployment in the small and medium enterprises. For example, like I said, the tax incentives for renewable energy generation, which is likely to improve the kind of business environment for companies affected by load shedding.
Cuba Houghton, it's been a great pleasure. I'm encouraged speaking to you. The continent is in safe hands, and congratulations once again.